The first thing I saw that morning wasn't the sunrise. It was red and blue lights tearing through the fog over my vineyard. 2 sheriff cruisers rolled slowly between the Cabernet rows my wife Hannah planted with her own hands after she survived cancer. Dew clung to the leaves, glowing under the flash of patrol lights like the vines were under interrogation. My heart pounded, but I didn't move. Behind the cruisers stood Darlene Whitmore, dressed like she was attending a ribbon cutting instead of a raid, her phone held high, live streaming to her precious Whitmore Ridge community page. She looked pleased, prepared, like she'd been waiting for this. One of the deputies approached me calmly and asked the question Darlene clearly rehearsed him for. "Sir, can you prove you're legally operating this vineyard?" Darlene's lips curled. She announced that my land violated their so-called agricultural compliance overlays, as if her subdivision rules outranked my deed. I wasn't afraid. I was angry. Because I already knew something she didn't. And if I proved what I truly controlled on this land, her entire luxury subdivision wouldn't just lose an argument. It could collapse under county review. I looked at the flashing lights reflecting off my irrigation trench and realized this wasn't about grapes. It was about water, and they had no idea whose hands it was in. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? 3 years before the sheriff's lights painted my vines red and blue, Hannah and I were sitting in a sterile hospital room listening to a doctor say the word remission. It didn't feel real at first. For nearly 2 years, our lives had revolved around treatment schedules, white walls, quiet prayers at 2 in the morning, and the fragile hope that we might still grow old together. When the scans finally came back clean, we didn't celebrate loudly. We just held hands and cried. Then Hannah said something that changed everything. "If we're still here," she whispered, "let's stop living like we're waiting to die." We sold the city house within months. The mortgage, the traffic, the constant hum of everything. It all felt temporary after what we'd been through. We wanted land, space, something living that required patience and care. That's how we found 15 acres in Millhaven Valley, a stretch of low, fertile ground tucked beneath a rolling ridge of old pasture land. Thomas Bellamy owned it then. 4th-generation farmer. Weathered hands, quiet eyes. When we walked the property with him the first time, he stopped near the lowest part of the field where the soil dipped gently toward a narrow creek. "This land," he said, tapping his boot against the dirt, "decides what stays and what washes away." I laughed, thinking he meant flooding. "So it's a drainage issue?" He gave me a look I didn't understand at the time. "It's more than that. We bought it anyway." Hannah chose Cabernet vines. She said they were stubborn, resilient, hard to kill if you treated them right. That felt symbolic enough for us. We planted 2 acres that first spring. I still remember the way she knelt in the dirt, pressing each young vine into place like she was planting proof that she was still here. The vineyard became our second chance. Early mornings walking the rows, evenings watching the fog roll low across the valley. The land grounded us. It gave structure to days that used to be filled with hospital alarms. For a while, Millhaven Valley felt untouched by the kind of control we'd left behind in the city. Neighbors waved from tractors. Problems were handled with conversations, not committees. Then the ridge changed. Construction trucks started climbing the hill north of us. At first, it was just grading equipment. Then framing crews. Within a year, 43 luxury homes stood where cattle used to graze. Uniform roofs. Identical landscaping. Stone entrance sign with gold letters, Whitmore Ridge Estates. With it came something the valley had never really known, an HOA. Rules followed quickly. Lawn height regulations. Approved paint palettes. Architectural review boards. It was like someone had dropped suburbia onto farmland and expected the land to adjust. That's when I first saw her. White SUV parked at the edge of the ridge road overlooking my lower field. The windows were tinted, but I could feel the gaze. It happened more than once. Same vehicle. Same position. Watching. A week later, I met Darlene Whitmore in person. Polished blazer. Perfect posture. Smile sharpened at the edges. She introduced herself as the Whitmore Ridge board leader, though she carried herself like she owned the whole valley. Her voice was calm, measured, rehearsed. "We're simply ensuring aesthetic integrity and environmental compliance," she told me, eyes drifting toward my vines. "Agricultural operations can sometimes create complications." I told her this land had been agricultural long before her subdivision existed. She smiled again. "That depends on how you define boundaries." The first certified letter arrived not long after. Official letterhead. Legal phrasing. It claimed my vineyard constituted a commercial agricultural intrusion within a newly defined compliance overlay affecting Whitmore Ridge. According to the document, my lower field fell inside their impact buffer zone. I read it 3 times before I understood what they were implying. That their HOA guidelines somehow extended beyond their subdivision and into my property. I drove up to the ridge entrance the next morning. The homes were pristine. Lawns trimmed to surgical precision, not a single leaf out of place. It looked less like a neighborhood and more like a controlled exhibit. Darlene met me outside the clubhouse. "This isn't personal," she said smoothly, "but your operation may conflict with community standards." "Community standards don't rewrite deeds," I replied. Her eyes cooled slightly. "We'll let the board determine that." More letters followed. Formal notices, requests for documentation, language that sounded authoritative enough to intimidate someone unfamiliar with county processes. Hannah tried to brush it off at first. "They can't actually control our land," she said. I wanted to believe that. Then the final envelope came, stamped urgent. A formal cease operation review notice. It stated that if I could not provide satisfactory proof of compliance with their overlay, enforcement actions would begin. Blinds. Liens. Legal proceedings. I stood in our kitchen holding that letter while Hannah read over my shoulder. The valley outside the window looked exactly the same as it had the day we moved in. Calm. Open. Honest. But something had shifted. This wasn't just about vines anymore. It was the first time I realized Whitmore Ridge hadn't built homes on the hill. They'd built leverage. The emergency compliance meeting was scheduled for 7 in the evening at the Whitmore Ridge clubhouse, but by the time I arrived, the parking lot was already full. Luxury SUVs lined up like silent jurors. The clubhouse windows glowed warm and inviting from the outside, but the atmosphere inside felt anything but. I walked in alone. Darlene Whitmore stood at the front of the room beside a mounted screen, dressed in a tailored navy suit like she was presenting quarterly earnings instead of questioning my livelihood. Rows of Whitmore Ridge homeowners filled the chairs, murmuring quietly. Some of them avoided eye contact with me. Others stared openly, curious, cautious, maybe even entertained. "Mr. Mercer," Darlene said, her voice amplified through a small lapel mic. "Thank you for attending." I didn't respond. I just took a seat in the back. The lights dimmed. A satellite image of Millhaven Valley filled the screen. My vineyard. The creek. The ridge. Clean, crisp digital lines traced property boundaries in bright white. Then she clicked to the next slide. A red-shaded area appeared across the lower portion of my vineyard. Labeled Impact Buffer Zone. Whitmore Ridge Environmental Compliance Overlay. "There," she said, pointer tapping the screen. "As you can see, a portion of Mr. Mercer's commercial agricultural activity extends into the Whitmore Ridge Regulated Impact Zone." A low murmur passed through the room. I stood slowly. "That's not correct." Darlene smiled politely. The overlay was updated during final subdivision mapping. I stepped closer to the screen. Something about it bothered me instantly. The creek's alignment was unchanged. The ridge line was identical to the original county map I'd seen when we purchased the property. The contour lines matched perfectly. Only one thing had moved. The boundary between Whitmore Ridge and my land had shifted, subtly, surgically, just enough to swallow the lowest edge of my field. "That line wasn't there 3 years ago," I said. "Our planning consultants updated the mapping to reflect environmental realities," Darlene replied smoothly. "This is standard practice." Standard practice. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay steady. Environmental realities don't alter deeds. She didn't flinch. This isn't about deeds. It's about community impact. Another slide appeared. Bullet points, terms like runoff risk, aesthetic disruption, commercial incompatibility. It was crafted to sound technical, inevitable, official. Then came the threat. If the violation is not remedied, Darlene continued, the board is authorized to initiate escalating fines, file liens, and request county enforcement review. Someone near the front whispered, "We don't want flooding issues." Flooding. There it was again. After the presentation ended, several homeowners approached Darlene, nodding in approval. A few glanced at me with the kind of polite concern people reserve for someone who just doesn't fit. I left without arguing further. Arguing would have been emotional. And this wasn't emotional. It was engineered. 3 days later, the first deputies arrived at my gate. No lights. No sirens. Just a marked cruiser pulling up the gravel drive mid-morning while I was checking irrigation pressure. The deputy who stepped out was calm, almost apologetic. "We're just here for verification," he said. "There's a compliance concern raised by the Whitmore Ridge HOA." "Verification of what?" I asked. "Property usage and zoning boundaries." He carried a tablet. I noticed the same red overlay on his screen. "Who provided that?" I asked. He hesitated, came through with the complaint. Complaint. I walked him along the property line myself, showed him the original survey stake still embedded in the ground from when Thomas Bellamy owned it. The creek bed, the irrigation trench, the lower field. He didn't argue. He just recorded. "We're not making any determinations today," he said before leaving. "This is civil until the county reviews it." Civil. But it didn't feel civil. It felt like pressure. Over the next week, certified letters multiplied. Notices of non-compliance. Warning of penalties. References to municipal coordination. The language was strategic, not aggressive enough to appear malicious, but serious enough to imply inevitability. I spent nights at the kitchen table comparing the HOA overlay to my closing documents, to the county plat maps, to the old survey Thomas had handed me when we bought the land. The more I looked, the clearer it became. They hadn't misunderstood anything. They had moved a line. Not by accident, not through ignorance, through design. And the precision of it, the exact portion of land they absorbed, wasn't random either. It was the lowest drainage section of my property, the part that collected runoff during heavy storms. The part Thomas had stood on and said, "This land decides what stays and what washes away." The next letter arrived on a Friday afternoon. Normal, final. It stated that unless I removed all vineyard structures and ceased agricultural operations within 30 days, the Whitmore Ridge HOA would pursue full legal enforcement in coordination with county authorities. 30 days. Remove the vines. Remove the irrigation system. Remove the symbol of Hannah's survival. Or face enforcement. I folded the letter slowly and looked out across the lower field. This wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't about noise or traffic or property values. It was deliberate. And for the first time, I understood something that made my stomach tighten. They didn't want compliance. They wanted control, and they were willing to redraw the map to get it. The 30-day clock had barely started when the pressure turned relentless. The first county truck rolled in on a Monday morning. A code enforcement officer stepped out with a clipboard and a tight smile. "Routine inspection," he said. Routine. He measured my equipment shed and cited me for a ventilation modification that had been there since before we bought the land. 2 days later, an electrical compliance notice arrived questioning the load capacity of my irrigation pump. Then came an environmental runoff review request, complete with language suggesting my lower field posed a potential downstream risk. Downstream. Every notice referenced the same thing without saying it outright. Water. By the second week, it wasn't just paperwork. A Facebook group appeared. Whitmore Ridge Community Integrity. Someone had posted aerial images of my vineyard with a bold caption, "Mercer flood risk." Comments followed. Speculation. Claims that my land threatened their foundations. That their insurance premiums might spike because of unregulated agriculture. Hannah showed me the page on her phone one evening, her face pale. "They're making you sound dangerous," she said quietly. Suppliers began asking cautious questions. The nursery that sold us replacement vines delayed a delivery, pending zoning clarification. A distributor who'd been interested in carrying our first small batch of bottles stopped returning calls. The isolation was calculated. Economic pressure layered on top of legal intimidation. I told myself we could handle letters. We could handle inspections. We could even handle gossip. But then the heat came. A brutal stretch of late summer temperatures settled over Millhaven Valley. Days with the soil cracked and the air felt like it pressed against your lungs. During that kind of heat, irrigation wasn't optional. It was survival. On the third afternoon of that heat wave, I noticed the pressure gauge dipping unexpectedly. I walked the line. The first cut was precise clean through the main irrigation hose near the lower trench, then another 20 yards down. Then another, each incision angled in a way that guaranteed maximum pressure loss. This wasn't vandalism by a teenager. Whoever did it understood the system. By the time I shut off the pump, sections of the vineyard were already wilting. Hannah came out with me at dusk. She crouched beside a vine whose leaves had curled inward, brittle at the edges. She ran her fingers over it like she was checking a fever. "They want us gone," she whispered. The way she said it stopped me. Not angry, not dramatic, just certain. For a moment, the vineyard didn't look like resilience. It looked fragile again, and I saw something flicker in her expression, a memory of hospital rooms, of things slipping beyond control. That was my breaking point. Up until then, I'd been responding, defending, arguing in letters. But cutting irrigation during a heat wave wasn't enforcement. It was escalation. I installed temporary bypass lines through the night, hands shaking more from anger than fatigue. Every snip of hose echoed in my head. This wasn't about a buffer zone. It was about pushing us to fail. The next morning, instead of repairing more vines, I drove to the county records office. Millhaven's records room smelled like dust and old paper. Metal cabinets lined the walls, labeled in fading black letters. A clerk pointed me toward archived subdivision filings. I requested everything tied to Whitmore Ridge estates. Original plats, environmental impact assessments, stormwater modeling approvals. I laid the documents across a long wooden table and began comparing them to the digital overlay Darlene had presented at the meeting. The original subdivision map was clear. The Whitmore Ridge boundary stopped exactly where Patterson Ranch had ended decades ago, well above my lower field. The creek alignment matched my deed survey. The ridge line matched the original topographic filings. My land was untouched. Then I pulled up the updated overlay file submitted during final planning review. At first glance, it looked identical. Until I measured it. The boundary had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm someone skimming, but enough to pull the lowest drainage section of my vineyard into what they now called an impact buffer. I checked the submission metadata. It hadn't been altered by the county. It had been modified by a contracted planning services firm tied to Whitmore Ridge development. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen. They hadn't just pressured me. They had engineered this. The sabotage, the smear campaign, the inspections, the deputies showing up with a red overlay loaded on a tablet. It all traced back to one quiet digital adjustment. A line moved 30 yards downhill. And that line happened to swallow the very section of land Thomas Bellamy once warned me about, the place where runoff gathered, the place that decided what stayed and what washed away. The older subdivision map did not include my lower field. The new overlay did. And someone outside the county had modified it. I printed both versions and laid them side by side on the table. There it was. Proof that this wasn't misunderstanding. It was design. And for the first time since the sheriff's lights hit my vines, I didn't feel cornered. I felt focused. I didn't call just any attorney. I called Lydia Cortez. Thomas Bellamy had mentioned her name once, casually, over coffee at the grain co-op. If you ever get tangled in county water issues, he'd said, talk to Lydia. She reads maps like other people read novels. When I walked into her office with 2 rolled-up plat maps and a flash drive containing the modified overlay file, she didn't interrupt me once while I explained what had been happening. The inspections, the Facebook smear campaign, the irrigation sabotage, the shifted boundary. She just listened. Then she spread the maps across her conference table and adjusted her glasses. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the faint scratch of her pen and the hum of her computer as she pulled county GIS records. Finally, she looked up. They moved it. Not maybe, not possibly. They moved it. She zoomed in on the metadata of the updated overlay submission. This modification wasn't county-initiated. It was uploaded through a contracted planning consultant tied to Whitmore Ridge development. So it's fraud? I asked. It's manipulation, she said carefully. And manipulation becomes fraud when it's used to assert enforcement authority. She pulled another folder from a filing cabinet behind her desk. Now let's talk about why they'd risk that. Inside were stormwater management filings for Whitmore Ridge Estates. I recognized the project summary page from my own record search, but Lydia flicked deeper into the engineering appendices. See this? She said, pointing to a shaded section in the hydrology model. The lowest portion of the watershed diagram overlapped almost perfectly with my lower field. That area, she continued, is listed as overflow mitigation capacity during heavy rainfall events. It's part of the downstream runoff channel. I felt my pulse steady. That's my land, I said. Yes, she replied. And according to the original approval schedule, final hydrology certification was pending when construction began. You're saying they built 43 houses before confirming their drainage compliance? She met my eyes. I'm saying they assumed they would secure downstream control quietly. Silence settled between us. Everything snapped into place. The inspections weren't about aesthetics. The Facebook rumors weren't about property values. The irrigation sabotage wasn't random cruelty. They needed my lower field. Without legal authority to manage overflow across my parcel, Whitmore Ridge faced exposure insurance risk, permit revocation, investor panic. They hadn't targeted grapes. They had targeted drainage. Lydia reached for another document, older than the rest. The paper was yellowed at the edges, stamped with multiple county validations over decades. This, she said slowly, is what they didn't expect you to have. Buried in the transcription was a phrase that made Lydia tap the page with her pen. Watershed allocation rights. Your parcel, she explained, carries exclusive beneficial control over the runoff channel within the original grant boundary. It's rare, but not unheard of in older agricultural lands. Essentially, you control drainage usage through that section. I stared at the document. You mean? I mean, she interrupted gently. They can't legally rely on your field for stormwater mitigation without your consent. And if they've engineered infrastructure assuming access they don't have, that's a compliance problem. A big one. The air felt different in that office. For weeks I'd been reacting to letters, to inspections, to accusations. I'd been defending something symbolic. Our vineyard, Hannah's survival, our peace. But this was different. This wasn't sentimental. It was structural. Whitmore Ridge wasn't trying to silence a farmer. They were trying to secure control of a drainage valve they didn't legally own. And if I assert these rights? I asked. Lydia leaned back. The county water board initiates review. Their stormwater retention system gets audited. If the models don't align with real legal authority, they face redesign requirements. Possibly civil penalties. I thought about Darlene's confidence at the meeting, the clean red overlay, the polished language about compliance. They weren't enforcing rules. They were racing a deadline. How fast would that review move? I asked. Faster than they'd like. I felt something shift inside me then, not anger, not fear. Clarity. For the first time since the deputies rolled through my vines, I wasn't cornered. I was holding leverage. I drove home that evening with copies of the watershed allocation record secured in a folder on the passenger seat. Hannah was waiting on the porch when I pulled in. "Did you find anything?" she asked. I handed her the document. She read the highlighted section slowly. "So, they need our land for runoff?" "Yes. And they don't have the right." "No." I folded the document and looked toward the ridge where Whitmore Ridge estate stood polished and confident under the setting sun. "This isn't about proving them wrong in a meeting," I said quietly. Hannah watched me carefully. "So what is it about?" "It's about letting them reveal how desperate they are." She understood immediately. No shouting matches. No emotional outbursts. No public arguments that could be twisted. Just documentation. Procedure. Patience. I looked out across the lower field, the very ground they tried to swallow with a digital line. "I'm not defending grapes anymore," I said. "I'm holding their drainage compliance." Hannah's lips curved slightly. "What do we do?" I thought about Darlene's live stream smile. The red overlay. The irrigation cuts in the heat. And for the first time, I felt calm. "We won't fight emotionally," I said. "We'll let them panic." Lydia didn't announce anything publicly. That was the first move. She filed a quiet notice with the county water board asserting review of watershed allocation authority tied to my parcel. No accusations. No dramatic language. Just a procedural trigger. A request for clarification on downstream stormwater reliance within the Whitmore Ridge development boundary. "It won't make noise at first," she told me. "But it will show up on their radar." That was enough. 2 days later, I installed a bright orange sign at the lowest edge of my field, not near the road where passing traffic might see it, but angled deliberately toward the ridge. Authorized. Watershed Retention Project. Active drainage zone. No trespassing. I made sure it stood just high enough to be visible from the Whitmore Ridge Overlook Road. By late afternoon, I saw the white SUV. Darlene's. It slowed at the ridgeline. Stopped. Stayed there longer than usual. That evening, Lydia called. They received notification of the water board inquiry. "Response?" I asked. "Silence," she said, "which means panic. I didn't argue with anyone at this stage. I didn't reply to the last compliance email. I didn't attend the informal HOA discussion forum they scheduled for concerned residents. Instead, I installed trail cameras along the lower trench line and near the boundary stakes. Motion triggered. Cloud-backed. Time-stamped. I also pulled my drone out of storage, a mid-range model I'd bought to survey vine growth patterns during planting season. I upgraded the firmware and attached a small thermal module I'd originally used to check irrigation leaks at night. If they were desperate enough to cut hoses during a heat wave, they were desperate enough to escalate. 3 days passed quietly. Then Thomas Bellamy called. "Check your email," he said without greeting. He had forwarded a screenshot from a Whitmore Ridge internal message board. Someone had leaked it to him through a cousin who worked landscaping on the ridge. Subject line: "You are gent bored." She described my watershed sign as an intimidation tactic and claimed I was attempting to disrupt community infrastructure. She urged residents not to engage with me directly and assured them the board was handling the situation. Below that, a reply from someone named Marcus Whitmore, likely connected to the original development firm, warned about investor sensitivity to hydrology audits. Another message read, "If this triggers redesign, we're exposed." Thomas sent one final text beneath the forwarded emails. "They're in crisis mode." I didn't feel triumphant reading that. I felt steady. For weeks, I'd been reacting to their pressure. Now they were reacting to mine, and I hadn't raised my voice once. Lydia advised patience. "Don't provoke," she said. "Let them decide whether to act stupid." The air in Millhaven Valley shifted over the next few evenings. The ridge felt tense, like a place waiting for a storm. I noticed fewer casual walkers near the overlook, fewer lingering vehicles. But the white SUV appeared twice more. Each time, it paused at the sight of the orange sign. The third night, I stayed up late reviewing camera feeds. Nothing unusual. Just deer moving through the brush and the quiet hum of insects. Around midnight, I powered down the monitor and tried to sleep. At 2:57 in the morning, my phone vibrated once on the nightstand. Motion alert, lower field south. I grabbed it instantly. The screen showed faint movement near the retention trench. 2 figures. Dark clothing. I was out of bed before I fully processed it. By the time I reached the porch, another alert hit. Boundary stake. East line. The thermal drone was already powered and charged from earlier checks. I launched it from the yard, keeping the ascent low and quiet. Through the thermal feed, 3 heat signatures came into view. 1 stood upright near the orange sign. 2 crouched low near the trench line. They weren't wandering. They were working. I zoomed slightly. The upright figure shifted, and even in thermal blur, I recognized the posture. The stance. The white SUV parked just beyond the ridgeline confirmed it. Darlene. She wasn't supervising from a distance this time. She was physically present. One of the crouched figures reached toward a boundary marker. Another motion alert flashed across my screen. Active sign, tampering detected. My heart wasn't racing the way it had when deputies rolled in weeks ago. It was controlled. Focused. I stepped off the porch slowly, boots steady against the gravel. Another vibration pulsed in my hand. Motion detected. 3:17 in the morning. The white SUV didn't bother with subtlety anymore. It rolled fully past the boundary post and onto my gravel access lane like it belonged there. Headlights cut across the lower field, washing over the orange watershed sign and the freshly set survey stakes that marked the trench line. From the thermal feed hovering above, I watched 3 heat signatures step out. Darlene Whitmore was one of them. No blazer tonight. Dark jacket, hair pulled back. No phone livestream this time. 2 men followed her toward the trench. They moved with purpose, not wandering, not hesitating. One carried a pry bar. The other had a shovel. I guided the drone slightly higher, careful to keep distance but maintain clarity. The camera timestamp glowed in the corner of my screen. Every movement documented. One of the men crouched near the east boundary stake and began working it loose from the soil. The other stepped toward the orange sign and drove the pry bar beneath its base. Darlene walked straight to the trench line. She looked down into the shallow retention channel Lydia had advised me to mark clearly after filing notice. It wasn't deep, just a defined cut designed to show drainage flow direction, but it was enough to make the area unstable if someone stepped carelessly. "Move it," she hissed at one of the men. "It doesn't belong here." Belong. The word hung in the air like it had during the meeting weeks earlier. I stepped out from the shadows of the equipment shed and began walking toward them. Not rushing. Not shouting. Just walking. The drone hovered above us, its faint hum nearly lost in the night breeze. One of the men noticed me first. He froze. Darlene turned sharply. For a split second, surprise crossed her face. Not fear yet, just calculation adjusting to a new variable. "You're trespassing," I said evenly. Her composure snapped back into place. "This is a disputed impact zone." "No," I replied. "It isn't." Behind her, the man with the shovel tugged harder at the boundary stake. It shifted. I lifted my phone and angled it upward slightly. The drone's small navigation light blinked red against the dark sky. Darlene followed my gaze. Then she heard it, the faint mechanical whir of the drone adjusting position. Her face changed. Not dramatic. Not panicked. But aware. "You're recording?" she asked quietly. "Time-stamped." "Cloud-backed," I answered. "And thermal." The man with the pry bar stepped away from the sign slowly. The other released the stake. Darlene glanced toward the SUV, then back at me. "You're escalating this unnecessarily," she said, trying to reclaim control. "We're protecting community interests." "At 3:17 in the morning?" I asked. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, none of us moved. The drone hovered steadily overhead, capturing every angle. Her boots sinking slightly into the soft mud near the trench, the displaced gravel around the sign, the shovel blade reflecting faint moonlight. She took one step backward, and her heel slipped. The mud near the trench gave way under her weight. She dropped knee-deep into the softened soil, catching herself with one hand against the signpost. The moment lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Enough to show physical interference. Enough to show presence inside a clearly marked drainage zone. One of the men reached to help her up. She swatted his hand away and stood on her own, mud streaked along her pant leg. "Leave," I said calmly. The two men retreated toward the SUV without argument. Darlene lingered one heartbeat longer. "This isn't over," she said, voice low. "No," I replied. "It isn't." She got into the SUV without another word. The engine revved, headlights swung wide, and then they were gone. I lowered the drone slowly, hands steady despite the weight of what had just happened. I didn't feel victorious. I felt certain. By morning, my phone buzzed with notifications. Emergency HOA, board meeting, mandatory attendance. Subject line, immediate enforcement action vote, regarding Mercer property. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening. Darlene's message framed it as a necessary response to unauthorized construction activity and continued defiance of community regulations. Not a word about midnight trespass. Not a word about trench interference. Just enforcement. Thomas called before noon. "They're trying to get ahead of something," he said. "Word spreading." "I know," I answered. "Lydia reviewed the footage that afternoon." "They walked straight into it," she said quietly. "Don't respond publicly yet. Let them call the meeting." That night, I stood at the edge of the lower field again, watching the ridge lights flicker on as homeowners returned from work. 43 houses. 43 families who had no idea how thin the line was between stable ground and exposed liability. The emergency meeting wasn't about my vineyard anymore. It was about containment. They would try to vote on enforcement. They would try to assert authority publicly before the water board inquiry gained traction. And I would let them. Because what they didn't know was that Lydia had already confirmed attendance from someone who didn't answer to Darlene, someone whose authority didn't depend on HOA bylaws. The next evening, the community center filled beyond capacity. Residents packed the rows. Whispers moved like static through the room. Darlene stood at the front, composed again, gavel resting beside her folder of documents. I took a seat near the aisle, drone footage stored securely, watershed documents in a leather folder on my lap. This meeting would decide everything. As Darlene raised her gavel in the packed community center, she had no idea I had already scheduled something she couldn't silence. The room was already full when Darlene brought the gavel down. Whitmore Ridge residents filled the front rows in pressed shirts and cautious expressions. Behind them, lining the back wall, stood farmers from Millhaven Valley Boots, dusty, arms crossed, watching quietly. Thomas Bellamy was there. So were 2 vineyard owners from the next county over who had heard about the drainage dispute. It wasn't just an HOA meeting anymore. It felt like a trial. Darlene cleared her throat. "This emergency session concerns ongoing non-compliance and unauthorized watershed interference by Mr. Darlene. Mercer Murmurs rippled forward. I didn't stand. I didn't interrupt. Instead, Lydia Cortez rose from the aisle seat beside me. She hadn't announced herself yet, but when she stepped forward holding a slim leather folder and introduced herself as counsel representing watershed allocation rights tied to my parcel, the energy in the room shifted instantly. Darlene's smile thinned. This is an internal HOA matter, she said tightly. It became a county matter the moment altered boundary submissions were used to assert enforcement authority, Lydia replied calmly. She handed copies of a document to the board members at the front table. Historic land grant validation. County re-recorded deed transcripts. Highlighted section, Watershed Allocation Authority within original boundary lines. These rights, Lydia continued, establish exclusive beneficial control over the downstream runoff channel crossing Mr. Mercer's lower field. Any infrastructure reliance on that channel without formal agreement is subject to review. A man in the second row raised his hand. Are you saying our drainage depends on his land? Lydia didn't dramatize it. I'm saying the development's hydrology model references overflow mitigation capacity within that boundary. Eyes turned toward Darlene. She adjusted papers quickly. That's a misinterpretation of planning language. Lydia nodded once and signaled to me. I stood and connected my laptop to the projector cable that Darlene had been using for her compliance slides. The screen flickered. Then the drone footage began. Night vision clarity, timestamp glowing in the corner. The white SUV entering my property, 3 figures stepping out. One clearly identifiable. Gasps broke the room's composure as the footage showed the men working at boundary stakes. Then Darlene herself stepping toward the trench. The moment she slipped knee-deep in mud beside the clearly posted Authorized Watershed Retention Project sign, played in complete silence. No one laughed. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint audio hum captured by the drone. The footage ended with her being told to leave. The screen went black. Silence. The kind that carries weight. Darlene stood abruptly. This is an invasion of privacy. It was recorded on my property during unauthorized entry, I said evenly. Before she could respond further, a man rose from the side row near the wall. Harold Gaines, county supervisor. He hadn't announced himself when he entered. He didn't need to. I've reviewed preliminary documentation regarding watershed allocation and subdivision overlay modification, he said calmly. The county is initiating formal review into altered boundary submissions associated with Whitmore Ridge estates. A visible wave moved through the front rows. Altered? Someone whispered. Harold continued. Metadata confirms digital planning overlays were modified through third-party channels prior to enforcement attempts. All eyes shifted to Darlene again. Her composure fractured. This was to prevent catastrophic investor collapse, she snapped suddenly. If the runoff modeling failed, the entire development would have faced redesign. Hundreds of families would have lost value. We had to act. The admission hung in the air longer than any accusation could have. You could feel the moment residents understood. This hadn't been about aesthetic integrity. It had been about financial exposure. A deputy who had been standing near the entrance stepped forward at Harold's subtle nod. Ms. Messon. Whitmore, he said calmly. You'll need to accompany us pending formal investigation into boundary misrepresentation and unauthorized entry. She looked around the room as if searching for support. No one moved. The farmers at the back didn't gloat. The homeowners at the front didn't defend her. They simply watched. The deputy guided her toward the exit. Not forceful, not dramatic. Procedure. As the doors closed behind them, Lydia stepped forward again. The water board will begin compliance audit procedures effective immediately, she said clearly. This is not punitive. It is corrective. Corrective. That word settled the room. Because suddenly, the narrative had flipped. I wasn't the one disrupting stability. I was the one holding documentation. I wasn't threatening property values. I was protecting legal clarity. A man from the second row stood slowly. Does that mean we're at risk? Harold answered carefully. It means your development will undergo hydrology verification and infrastructure review. That is standard when discrepancies appear. No drama, no shouting. Just reality. I looked around the room. The front rows no longer leaned forward in suspicion. They leaned back in reconsideration. For weeks, Darlene had framed me as the problem. Now the problem had walked out under escort. As the meeting dissolved into hushed conversations, I stepped outside into the cool night air. Red and blue lights flashed briefly across the parking lot as the deputy vehicle pulled away. Residents lingered near the entrance, speaking quietly among themselves. The ridge above the valley looked different somehow. Not smaller physically, but stripped of illusion. For the first time since Whitmore Ridge estates rose on that hill, the power dynamic felt balanced. As the sheriff lights faded outside, the subdivision looked smaller than it had ever seemed. 6 months later, Millhaven Valley felt quieter again. Not silent, just honest. Just honest. Whitmore Ridge Estates was still standing on the hill, but construction trucks had returned, this time for redesign instead of expansion. County water engineers walked the perimeter weekly, measuring gradients and recalculating flow capacity. Retention ponds were widened. Drainage channels were reinforced. Everything documented. Everything reviewed. Darlene Whitmore was no longer board leader. The homeowners voted her out within weeks of the investigation going public. Marcus Whitmore, tied to the original development filings, was facing civil inquiry over the altered boundary submission and hydrology misrepresentation. I didn't follow every detail. I didn't need to. What mattered was this: the system was now working the way it should have from the beginning. No hidden overlays, no late-night trespass, no redrawn lines. The vineyard survived the heat damage. It took work. Long mornings replacing stressed vines, careful irrigation monitoring, patient pruning, but the roots held. Cabernet clusters hung heavy again by late summer, darker and fuller than our first harvest. Our second batch of wine was curing in the barn now. Barrels lined neatly against the far wall, wood scent mixing with the cool earth smell that always drifted through the open door at dusk. Hannah stood beside me one evening as the sun dipped low over the lower field. The irrigation system clicked on automatically, sprinklers turning in steady arcs across the vines. Legally. Transparently. No one questioned them anymore. From where we stood, we could see the ridge in the distance. Whitmore Ridge's lights flickered on one by one as families settled into dinner routines and evening television. There was no anger in me when I looked up there. Just perspective. When power hides behind paperwork and polished language, arguing loudly only feeds it. The real leverage isn't in shouting. It's in reading carefully. It's in finding the line they moved and asking why. I looked down at the lowest edge of the vineyard, the field that had almost been swallowed by a digital shift. The same soil Thomas Bellamy once tapped with his boot and warned me about. This land decides what stays and what washes away. He was right. It wasn't just about water. It was about pressure and patience. Hannah slipped her hand into mine, and for the first time in a long time, there was no tension in her grip. Just peace. The sprinklers kept turning. The vines rustled softly in the evening breeze. Fog began to settle gently into the trench line, exactly where it always had. Our land hadn't changed. Only the illusion around it had, and as the sky darkened over Millhaven Valley, I felt something steady settle inside me. Not victory. Balance. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?